Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this guest talk today. Thanks for joining us and great to see you here. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, then we'll get cracking and there will be lots of time for question and answer as well. Before we start, I will put in the chat a link to the Slido page, which is where we'll kind of collate questions. You can upvote questions and then we'll move on to those in the second half of the talk. If there's any kind of urgent issues or something isn't working with that, you can use the chat as well, but it just helps us to collate those questions. So I've put the link in the chat there and I'll send it again in a moment. But yeah, very excited and grateful to be welcoming our guest speaker today. Marina Haydn is a senior sustainability strategist at Qantas and has lots of environmental sustainability expertise, especially through her previous role as Executive Vice President for Sustainability at The Economist Group, where Marina pioneered the organization's first sustainability strategy and embedded it across the organization. The strategy includes a science-based emissions reduction target, alongside lots of other measures, including renewable energy efficiency, carbon removal, and nature-based solutions as well. So lots of exciting experience from The Economist and now also at Qantas. So Marina's going to talk to us about all that sorts of experience about setting sustainability strategy, a bit about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and things like that. So we'll enjoy the talk. Over to you, Marina. And as I say, we'll collate questions in Slido and have a bit more of a conversation in the second half of the session. So thank you again.
Sure. Thanks very much, Liam, for the introduction. And yes, great to be back. So the one thing that Liam didn't mention is that I'm also a Terra.do alumni.
Of course. I forgot the most important bit. Sorry.
Not a problem. I was an Orca, and it was very much an important part of my journey as well as I was going along. So good to be here, and yeah, really a pleasure just to share some of the learnings that I've had. Today I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a person, but also of course with the support of Qantas as an organization. So absolutely credit goes to Qantas, and any of the examples that I'm showing are from publicly available information on some of the companies that are within here. So that's just sort of a disclaimer, and I'll be passing on links for the publicly available websites as we go along. But yeah, I would love this to be interactive. I will, I think, perhaps just run through my, sort of slides that we can open up for discussion. And I can see there's already a lot of questions on scope 1, 2, and 3, which is good. And possibly we will be answering some of those questions as we go along, which would also, of course, be a good advantage. So effectively, I'm going to take you through 2 components to corporate science-aligned climate strategies. And the first component is simply going to be the why. And the second component is the how. The how can get a bit technical across all the different scopes and the value chain. So I thought it would make sense to just back up a little bit and cover the why first. And dwell also a little bit on this point of being science aligned, which is already a step beyond being, let's just say, marketing objective aligned. So, of course, you all know that we're on a path towards significant global warming. You know that we need to be working within finding the space, the safe space for the safe operating space for humanity. And the fact that right now we really must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And within this, everybody and every player needs to do their part so that the world can be net zero aligned by 2050. And basically companies within this also need to be contributing. Of course, also the how really matters in terms of, how quickly do we get to net zero? The IPCC has been, outlining a very specific, carbon budget so that we can stay within 1.5 degrees. And we need to bear in mind that different net zero goals can really mean different things. I mean, if a company has a net zero goal, it doesn't really guarantee that it is a 1.5 aligned goal. And if a company decides to behave basically as business as usual for 10 more years and then reduce later, the carbon budget is going to be more than exceeded. So, you know, it's sort of the curve of the trajectory, which is really, really critical on net zero strategies. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back to this slide one more time again, because the difference here you can see on this yellow line, of course, if we let emissions continue to increase, specifically from a corporate perspective, you then have to decrease them even more radically later on. So it's this time horizon here, everything that we are seeing right in front of us, the focus needs to be on getting companies to reduce as quickly as possible and not, you know, increase and then decrease at a later stage. Unfortunately, there are a number of you know, plans which sort of have this shape, which is a bit counterintuitive. So as you know, the world is really not on track to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, and more information is coming out on this. You know how dramatic the light green scenario looks for 1.5. And then you can also see, you know, where we currently are, which is this blue frame on policies and actions, sort of varying between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees. I believe you have Chip Fletcher coming up in the course very soon, so he's probably going to go through this in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to zip along to that point on where companies can actually contribute and what the target setting around, you know, their realm is looking like. So basically, you know, on the left, you can see, you know, the objective for the world is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, and companies need to share that objective because government cannot do it alone. Specifically, you know, Alex Sharma recently at a sustainability event in London was saying very, very clearly, have no illusion, the corporate world cannot lean back and wait for regulation to happen, but they need to start really driving forward their action in parallel, and specifically also defining and starting to implement the measures. Otherwise, it will simply be too late. So on the global side, you know, there's a call to have emissions by 2030 and then reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the role that companies need to be playing within this is really to be able to maximize their contribution to this global goal. Otherwise, governments will not be able to get there either. So it's really marrying up and creating a link between the global goals that the Paris Agreement has set out and how companies can meet those within their spheres of influence. Now, the interesting thing is that each company can really take a different path to reach the same goal, and each company also has a completely different set of challenges to face. I think the first sort of important focus point is this area on reducing direct and indirect emissions. That is everything that is in the company's direct control. There needs to be a very firm focus on this. The second bucket is really enabling others to reduce. So once an organization is starting to look beyond its own direct emissions, it's about, you know, how can other partners and players across its own supply chain and value chain be involved. And then the two categories below, insetting and offsetting, are another, you know, group of things that companies can do. Offsetting, I'm sure you'll be familiar with. It is a phrase, you know, related to carbon offsetting, where you can purchase validated certificates. This is sometimes also seen as greenwashing, but should not be excluded, because some of this is also really included in the IPCC reports. It's more just a question of monitoring and mechanism and ensuring that there are also strict standards around offsetting. Insetting is when a company chooses to do carbon removals within its own value chain and also has the mechanisms to do that. So for example, companies that are operating in agricultural sectors actually have the opportunity to, you know, turn land areas that they control into carbon sequestration positive places. So basically, each company can choose its own way, depending on the, sort of the resources and spheres of influence available to them. Did want to take a little bit of a dive to take you through some of the terminology around corporate, let's call it carbon management. So there are real scientific terms around carbon neutrality, net zero, and carbon negative, which I will explain. And then there are market definitions of these same things. So the market is already making decisions around, which phrase is more popular in a climate action context. So it has become a bit of a marketing competition on the sustainability space for companies to be particularly ambitious. So now I'm going to talk about each definition on its own. So first, when we talk about carbon neutrality, this is really technically pertaining to carbon only, excluding other types of emissions. And here it is really quite simple. You reduce as much carbon emissions as possible, and then you balance the remaining carbon emissions through removals. So either that insetting or that offsetting that I was mentioning before. Net zero technically covers all greenhouse gas emissions, reducing as much greenhouse gas emissions as possible, and then balancing the remaining GHGs through removals. I think the important thing here is that it is really also, reduction focused and has specified removals instead of just insetting or offsetting, but really permanent removals. And then on the carbon negative front, on the carbon negative front, it's really just ensuring that you're removing more GHG emissions from the atmosphere than you emit. So in terms of the market definition, the market is viewing some of these as different levels of ambition. And to make a long story short, the highest level of ambition is really having net zero, science-based aligned targets, and the neutrality claims are seen either as sort of a slightly lower level of ambition or as a pre-level. And sometimes within large organizations, there will be a net zero goal at a group level, but then brands within the company will be declaring carbon neutrality as the brand will be able to, have, let's say, insetting or offsetting running for a particular product line. And then that will become part of their net zero strategy for the future. I hope this is not too technical for you, which is why I'm now going to take you through 3 examples of exactly those 3 things. Sometimes makes this complexity a little bit easier to understand. So the first example would be carbon neutrality. So EasyJet, you may know, a European low-cost airline has declared carbon neutrality, and it's because they are actually one of the first airlines that has decided to offset the equivalent of all of their fuel used across all flights across their network. They are supporting afforestation and deforestation, prevention of deforestation projects, and supporting renewable energy projects. And these projects are, very much, closely verified, etc. And they're relatively transparent about the fact that this is only an interim measure because they are an airline. They have very limited, let's say, levers in their hands at the moment, because air travel, aside from simply flying less or not at all, there's a relatively big gap between low emission or zero emission aircraft, simply because it's technically very difficult. So it's transparent. It is fair to say it is carbon neutral, but it is not a net zero commitment. Net zero, this is an example from Nestlé, is a very sophisticated and detailed roadmap. Of course, there's more below this graph that you were seeing, but basically it is very much focusing on tackling the core components of their operations and finding ways to reduce the emissions related to those in accordance with science. So already have a very specific goal by 2025 to actually be reducing the emissions in their core operations by 20%, and then go even further by 2050 across all of the areas across their value chain. And we'll go into that example in a little bit more detail later. Just now, I'm just trying to show different approaches. But what you'll notice is that this pathway is very reduction focused. Whereas if we go to the third example, which is carbon negative, this is already introducing the concept and the notion of permanent carbon removal and also avoided emission offsets sort of somewhat earlier into the plan. So it is something that they have actually been already working on to invest in future-oriented technologies such as direct air capture and others, so that the removal component is actually part of their strategy from the outset. Within their own supply chain, they're looking, and investing significant amounts into renewable energy, of course, and then also, yes, have set up this 1 billion climate innovation fund, which is not directly linked to their target, but the idea being through climate innovation, they will actually be able to support technologies that are evolving to progress on the removal side. So that was just really to underline, the terminology. What I'd like to focus on from here is really the corporate climate strategies that are pursuing science-based targets, because this is really the, say, the highest standard in the realm of voluntary corporate action, which is really trying to do what we said at the beginning, which was match the world's targets of 1.5 to what a company would need to do to be able to get there. So the Science-Based Target Initiative defines and promotes best practice in emissions reduction and net zero targets. There needs to be guidelines around this. It also helps and provides technical assistance to companies who set these targets. And they also have teams of experts that then actually validate and check in on these targets. And it's really a partnership of the UN Global Compact, the CDP, which is an organization which is stemming from the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is helping companies disclose carbon, also the World Resources Institute and WWF. And yeah, I think the most important point here is, we all know the Paris Agreement. The Science-Based Target Initiative is the initiative that translates the Paris Agreement for companies. So by January 2022, already 2,500 companies have signed up to a science-based target, and you can see just the speed of acceleration in terms of the numbers of organizations that are really heading into this direction. 805 already have commitments to net zero. 1,143 have science-based targets in principle. So what is happening is that at previous stages, net zero was not yet a sort of a commitment possibility because the framework needed to be completed. There is now a net zero framework, and companies can also be submitting net zero targets. So this is fairly recent, and that's why it is now also accelerating so quickly. So it's impressive. It's impressive that organizations are taking ambitious action, that they are choosing to be science aligned, and that they are moving forward in this direction. Now, before we even get to the target setting, it's really important to understand what needs to be done on measurement. So what companies are doing is following the greenhouse gas protocol. This is the basis for all corporate footprints and reporting. And what it does is it also provides basically an accounting framework for companies to disclose carbon as they would revenue and cost. I have a basic 3-minute video from the GHG protocol, which I'm going to save towards the end. if we'd like to consume it, but it basically just explains this in a little bit more detail. But I'm going to take you through the more, let's say, the less animated yet live version of this, and just really talk you through the lingo. If you are not, or let me just pause for a second. If you could just drop in the chat, how many of you are already familiar with the term scope 1, 2, and 3? It would just be great to just see if this is a new term, or if this is already basically pretty familiar to you. So I'm just looking to see. So yes, familiar, no, familiar vaguely, somewhat. Okay, very surface level. Good. Okay, great. This is a good mix. And to those that have said a resounding yes, please then also feel free to drop in any comments or examples that might support in explaining it even further. But yes, so very simple. Scope 1 and 2 are often sort of grouped together. And the reason why is because scope 1 and 2 are still, even though they're confusingly called direct and indirect, they're still the areas which are within the organization's more or less direct control. And I'll explain that on scope 2 in a minute. Scope 1, direct emissions from the sources controlled by the company. Let's assume the organization is a printing company, and to actually print pamphlets or leaflets or whatever they are printing, they actually need to run run machines to do so, and actually have energy facilities on site. The direct emissions from the on-site energy facilities that they have, which are not purchased electricity, would be their scope 1. Scope 2, indirect emissions generated by purchased electricity and consumed by the company. That is the energy that they actually need to purchase, either from the grid or through gas pipelines or through other locally generated energy sources. The reason why it's still within the company's control is that they can influence it, but they can't necessarily always choose. So if you're purchasing electricity from the grid, you can make choices about what type of electricity you want to purchase if you're in a country where that is possible, but you may not be able to influence it fully. Other indirect emissions are everything that is not directly under the company's control. And that means everything that the company is either purchasing or dealing with. And if they, for example, need to purchase other goods to produce the actual goods that they're making, it also includes all the transportation and energy related activities within that. So usually for most organizations, scope 3 is also the largest impact factor. And it is also the hardest to, basically to capture, because it can get very, very complex. Scope 3 is largely divided into two areas, upstream and downstream categories. So what it means on the upstream side is basically everything that they need to, let's say, need energy to bring in to their value chain. And downstream is everything on the value chain related to getting their products to their customers, and then what actually happens from there. So downstream transportation and distribution, for example, is simply moving your product from A to Z. Processing of the sold products is actually, the later stages if you need to, add on packaging or to actually produce them. Then there's also the so-called use phase, which is included when a consumer is actually using, for example, if we're looking at, a company that is producing shampoo, there would then also be the energy related in the use phase to actually heating the water that customers are using to wash their hair. So it can get exceptionally complex, because it is really about looking at the full impact of the company's emissions and energy impact. So this is a specific example going back to Nestle, which we were speaking about earlier, just also extracted from their publicly available net zero roadmap to really look at the value chain in detail. So basically everything that we just had on that circle is now from a Nestle perspective, articulated in a line. Upstream, again, everything related to agriculture, the cooperatives, everything coming directly from the farmers, also the inputs that are going into the field. So for example, right now with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there's a lot of talk about fertilizers, and perhaps more and more people are now also familiar with the fact that fertilizer is a very, very important ingredient, which is being also traded from various parts of the world to actually get to farm to improve yields. And has very high emissions factors also attached to it. And then raw materials basically are shipped from all over the world to make products, and then so on and so forth. So manufacturing, packaging, logistics, etc. And perhaps also a little bit less known is that companies within their scope 3 are also responsible for the end of life for products and packaging. So that means, the energy required by recycling factories would be also included in this. So when an organization is really on its, let's say first legs of a sustainability journey, the most important thing in the very beginning is to capture all the GHG data. And this is simply a very challenging exercise because it has to, go into enormous amounts of detail across all of these categories that were just outlined. So it can be done in different ways. I think an easy category that applies to many companies is the business travel one. There it's, through travel expenses, travel agent reports that companies collect this information. It gets much more difficult when you then look at the scope 3 category, and this is where really yes, often expert help is needed for organizations to be able to do this type of work, where you have, yes, experienced people that are knowledgeable about the GHG protocol and how this works. So coming back from the detail on the accounting and the reporting, let's sort of remember what is the context on net zero. Clearly at the moment, we simply have more human-caused GHG emissions on the planet than we currently would like to have, coming from a variety of sources. I think it is important and interesting just to dwell on, the industries, fossil fuel combustion and industry are making up a very, very large chunk of those emissions. Land use change, so for example, deforestation is also a second large chunk, and agriculture and waste is sort of the third. And these human-caused emissions, of course, need to be balanced out by human-caused removals, but there's nowhere that availability of human-caused removals yet to be able to solve that problem. And indeed, this balanced picture, which we need to get to, is very, very far away, as you all know. So let's focus on how the science-based targets for companies are actually set. So before we were looking at these different emissions trajectories for the world. And now we're going to look at how does this actually translate to what a company actually needs to do. So let's assume an organization has just done all the reporting, which I was just highlighting from the GHG protocol. So you've gone through your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3, you've collected it. And basically there you have the baseline, which is the grand total number for your value chain emissions across your full base year. Science-based targets will basically suggest, or not suggest, but provide a framework for outlining an emissions reduction path that is consistent with 1.5 degrees. So the company needs to focus on the first 5 to 10 year period, and then also look at the residual emissions and what's going to be happening with those by 2050 to the latest. And then only at the very end, is the objective to start talking about removals. So the idea is really holistically to focus first on this near-term target setting, specifically now it's already 2022. So we used to say we had 10 years, now we only have 8, and the numbers keep getting shorter in terms of the time available. So now 8 years for near-term targets that are consistent with 1.5. And then the remainder of the effort goes into the long-term category, but the near-term targets really have the highest levels of ambition. So anytime an organization is saying we're setting science-based targets, there is already a strong degree of ambition wrapped up in that effort. And lastly here, it is important for organizations to also really work on beyond value chain mitigation. So basically set initiatives that they can accelerate the transition by working together with their suppliers, by setting a science-based target and then communicating that they will also, for example, require others to do so as well. Really, I'd like to just underline that a science-based target itself is really a paradigm shift itself. There's so many measures that companies need to undertake, such as energy efficiency, regenerative agriculture, eco-design, sustainable purchasing, etc. There's a lot that we know can be done, but it only gets us so far. So basically, once an organization has been through the process of identifying actions that they know they can easily set, there is often a gap. And the paradigm shift is really around this thought process from setting goals we know we can achieve to setting goals that we need to achieve. And it creates, often certainly a situation of discomfort when an organization is confronted with the reality that there is not yet a solution of how to easily or feasibly get to a science-based target. And this in itself becomes an innovation driver and also a driver of business strategy rethink, so that organizations can become more sustainable as they are on this trajectory. So I'm coming to conclusion. There are 4 key elements in science-based aligned net zero strategies. So the first is really on reduction, the near-term targets over 5 to 10 years, and then long-term by 2050, and both categories are mandatory. And only then is it about neutralizing those components with carbon removals, and also as they are continuing along this journey, really focusing on beyond value chain mitigation in the transition. That 4th part isn't necessarily measured, but it's absolutely encouraged. So I'm on my conclusion now. Really, a successful sustainability strategy for organizations, it simply is a journey. On the one hand, it needs to have a strong foundation of robust metrics and stakeholder expectations. People within the organization also really have to have a deep understanding of what this means. There needs to be continuous internal engagement and leadership buy-in. Without endorsement from the top, a sustainability strategy is not going to have the strength that it needs. It needs to be ambitious, achievable, science-based, so that the emissions reductions are also in line with the Paris Agreement, or in the best case, also more ambitious than that. It needs to be coupled with a concrete action roadmap for not only strategy execution, but also business model transformation. Business model transformation in the sense that often the models themselves will not allow to continue on a trajectory which is not positive from a carbon perspective. And then there needs to be clear governance and frequent monitoring. So I would love to basically, yes, open up for questions. And I'm just, I believe I have clicked away something. So I'm just curious if you can still see my screen, or wait a minute, let me just find you all. So I'm going to pause the share and come back to you.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we can still see the PowerPoint window. There we go. It's gone now. So yeah, great. Thanks so much, Marina, for digging into all of that. I know there's already tons of great questions in the Slido as well, and I know there's all sorts of things to unpack from that. But I just wanted to check if you still wanted to run that video, or if you felt like we covered it and people can dig into it later if they want to.
I think, yeah, perhaps let's get to the questions. I realize we only have sort of 20 minutes left. So yeah, and I see there are quite a lot in the Slido, so I'd rather let's prioritize those, and then I can just drop the link to the video in the chat.
Sure, great. So yeah, there's loads in here, and we'll see if we can get through as many as possible. But before I look at that, I know from a separate conversation that one of our audience members, Ed, is currently at another event with the Financial Times in London and has to rush off. But I'm going to give him a chance to ask his question just before we go to the others, and then he can run away. But it's a good question with hopefully a relatively short answer as well.
Sure.
Do you want to speak it out loud, Ed, or shall I?
Yeah, that's fine, Liam. Thanks very much. If you can hear me, Marina. Yeah, the Paris targets of for keeping us to 1.5 degrees and getting to net zero by 2050, unless I'm wrong, assume that the whole world has to get to net zero 2050. If that is the case, and we're looking at science-based targets for corporations or even for countries, wouldn't that naturally mean that the well-resourced and well-financed countries and companies should take a much earlier target for getting to net zero? Because if what they do is target getting to 2050 net zero, then we have to assume that the less well-resourced, less well-organized will be later, which means we all completely fail in our endeavor. Does the Science-Based Targets Initiative take into account the strength of those companies or countries, let's say, in order to recommend to them targets which they can reach, which will enable us globally to get to the target?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The Science-Based Target Initiative is really doing its best at the beginning of a complex process to be Paris aligned. I think the assumption behind it, and I'm not the expert on the assumption behind it, so please don't quote me on this. But the assumption is that companies around the world would do their fair share, but it is not divided up into a geographic context. It is divided up into sectoral categories, and there are sectoral guidances which are built for every specific industry worldwide to be able to hit their targets. So while the Paris Agreement looks at countries, SBTI looks at companies and sectors, which I think is just enormously logical, because also the sectors need to be facing this challenge together. So a particular area of expertise that I'm building is on like, for example, the food and agricultural sector. Here, the guidance is also going to be building in assumptions that in the future that sector can also be driving more sequestration than other sectors, because farming itself can become a carbon sequestering mechanism. Very, very difficult to, I think, even from a science-based perspective, have like a perfect plan, which currently, would sort of solve all problems together. So the sectoral approach is the one that is, basically heading into that direction, and definitely the companies which are setting targets first and pioneering in this area are the ones that are encouraging change across across their respective industries. I hope that broadly answers the question. Probably, if I would say, if I would give you the short answer, I would say I don't think that that the nut has been cracked with this, but it is a step in the right direction.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marina. Another kind of a tough question, in a sense, for the folks working on this, from Abwa in the Slido. It's the most popular question from the thumbs up from everyone else. If the focus in this work is primarily on getting companies to disclose their emissions and set targets, how or what, or is anything in place to hold companies accountable for their commitments, you know, to say you've made the right commitments, but also then you're meeting those commitments? What are the mechanisms in place for that at the moment?
So the mechanisms at the moment are still very few. So, you know, we are reliant on great journalists, for example, to actually uncover greenwashing, you know, media organizations actually having a close eye on what companies are doing, and then reporting about companies that are not holding to their targets is going to become more and more important. Right now, we are talking primarily around voluntary disclosure. So, you know, the next step is that this becomes, you know, a regulatory requirement, which is absolutely gathering speed. I think the most notable, you know, next step is the work that has been ongoing with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, also known as TCFD is the acronym. And this is now becoming a legal requirement for large companies in some countries. So for example, if we speak about the UK, since April 2022, so already speaking past tense, you know, probably a month ago, it has already become a legal requirement for large organizations to report on their climate risk. And for them to be able to report on their climate risk, they need to, you know, have recorded their GHG emissions, and they get better risk ratings if they have a science-based target in place. And then that information is basically used by you know, financial markets to evaluate the organization accordingly. But yes, until there is more strict legislation and regulation around the companies that, or the emissions that companies produce, we're still operating in a space of largely voluntary action.
Thanks, Marina. And I'm going to pick another one here from a question from Phil, which sort of extends that a little bit. How would a company demonstrate that they're on track for targets? Do they hire kind of carbon auditors in the same way they might hire financial auditors? And I think the answer is yes, but I'm also just kind of thinking about another lens on this, which is, you know, some of the big audit companies, consultancy companies have had criticism in the past where they're consulting for organizations, giving them advice on strategy and targets and goals, and then they're also the same organizations that are coming in and auditing them and checking that they're meeting those goals. So is that similarly happening with you know, companies like Qantas, where they're helping companies to set goals, set targets, but then also being brought in to audit those? Or are those functions kept separate by different companies? How does that all work?
So I would say absolutely traditional auditing companies and consultancies that have a specialism in financial auditing are absolutely moving into the space of carbon accounting auditing. And, you know, the two are often going hand in hand. So that is simply the system that is currently being used. I guess from my perspective, it would be, you know, useful to, you know, as you would divide your strategy consultancy from your auditing consultancy, you know, there would be a lot of sense in suggesting that companies should be using different organizations, you know, to either support on the actual creation of the information versus you know, versus the verification of it. So you know, there are many different operators in the field. You know, Qantas as an organization is really specialized on the science, and that is our specific home, and specialize on helping companies through their scope 3 assessments, in addition to the easier part of the scope 1 and 2, and then crafting strategies related to that. But for example, we do not offer a service you know, to verify officially as an auditor. So I think it's a healthy mix to have different types of organizations operating in this space.
Got it. Thanks, Marina. there's a question in here about how companies go about measuring their emissions, and I know you went through a few slides on that, so I'm gonna park that one, especially because later in June we're going to have someone from Rocky Mountain Institute come and talk to us a bit more about carbon accounting. So look out for that if this is particularly what you're interested in. And another question here was about how many companies set net zero goals, but then might support politicians or policies that are in opposition to those goals. I don't know if that's many companies, but certainly there are some big companies that do that. And the question was, how can we encourage them to align their lobbying or political influence with those goals? And I think you kind of touched on that with that little piece about outside of the value chain, trying to influence the journey that we're on. How much of that is part of those conversations, or is it kind of a nice to have bolt on at the end that most people aren't interested in engaging with?
I think it's a really central part to successful net zero strategies, and we see more and more, more and more come of it, because the areas are just becoming so hard for companies to control. Like if you are not, responsible for energy sources around you, or for example, if you take the area of transportation, every company needs to work with a logistics operation. But if you're purchasing logistics services and they are, simply environmentally unfriendly, then there's very, very little that you can do. Similarly, in agriculture, for example, it is a very subsidized driven area. So companies operating within agricultural areas who want to positively drive a sustainability agenda forward need to, work to also motivate legislators to put the right incentives in place and the right mechanisms and regulations in place. So I think to answer your question, it's a very important area, and there are now more and more organizations where companies can actually join and do positive lobbying. So lobbying has always had such a negative, obviously vibe around it, because the ad hoc, the first definition that people will think of is that it is lobbying so that companies are operating in their own interest in the best way. But what we're seeing more and more is companies starting to lobby for sustainability improvements and a regulatory environment to help support that. Because the problem with sustainability is that for a business, it very often conflicts with their fiduciary responsibility of maximizing profits. So you have a situation which is already conflicting to their core values, potentially conflicting to what their shareholders are expecting of them. And if the legal framework around them changes, then it's a fair playing field. So the level playing field conversation is an ongoing one.
Thanks, Marina, and I think that gets a little bit to Gautam's point in the questions as well. And in fact, I was maybe going to save this to the end, but I'll bring it out now, and then we'll come back to a couple of last questions, hopefully, because it touches on exactly this. And when you were a fellow with us at Terra, and we had lots of conversations about the kind of overall economic incentives for going on this path towards proper decarbonization. And at the end of the day, we still operate in an economy which is, which requires growth, which requires profit, and which requires companies to keep doing more of whatever they're doing. And that isn't always, or like it often is, at odds with a decarbonization pathway or a collective pathway to owning fewer super yachts and taking fewer airline journeys and consuming more things, but often the companies involved are their number one priority is to do more of what they're doing. So I just wonder if any of your thoughts on this have changed recently, or any kind of like key things that influence the work you do today in the context of an economic system which isn't particularly well designed to solve this problem.
I mean, I think what I see is that that large corporations can really play a driving role when their value chains are just monumentally large. So it really can be a driver for change, because their impact can really follow through across the entire supply chain, and you see large organizations making net zero commitments and then requiring that from their suppliers, and then it gets more and more people thinking about sustainability and the climate crisis, and making them responsible for formulating some sort of a response. And this is before making any legal changes. Now, I think the fundamental question is it fast enough? I would say, probably not. We know that things need to move much, much faster than they are today. And, it would just not make sense to not underline the urgency, because it is really paramount that we move quickly. But I do think there is value in the corporate world, starting to really turn their minds to how this problem can be solved across all, roles within an organization that are now becoming touched by sustainability. So I think it is perhaps not the most powerful lever within the system to drive change, because it is still operating from within the system, but it is confronting people within the system with the changes that are going to be required, and shows them how hard it will be to continue business as usual. And this is where the theme of business transformation and business model transformation is coming in. So this is sort of corporate speak for, we can't continue as we are today, and we have to do something dramatically different. And that means, for a car company to, change from selling 1 car per household to only 1 car per every 10 households, and thinking of, how to do, sharing models instead, et cetera, et cetera. So really out of the box change.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. That's a great answer. So 6 minutes left. I'll just see if we can squeeze in a few more questions. There's one which I actually put in because I hear this come out sometimes, and I've never quite wrapped my head around it. But when we talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, it often feels like scope 3 emissions could be considered somebody else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. For example, the business travel piece. If you think about the air miles, well, that's actually wrapped up in the emissions of the airline company, or the fuel company, or whatever it is. So and some people have said, well, are scope 3 emissions just double counting? If everybody dealt with their scope 1 and 2 emissions, scope 3 emissions, would they just disappear? So how are you thinking about this question, or can you help me understand it a bit more clearly?
Sure. And it is I think this is the best question on this on this debate, and is asked very often, and also recently was asked also by an economist editor on a sustainability panel at Sustainability Week. And there, his particular example, was perhaps even more obviously expressed. And he said, well, if just, all oil and gas companies worldwide would sort out their scope 1 and 2, we wouldn't, have a problem anymore, because that's, so the root thing that we're trying to get. And yes, and my answer to this question is that there is overlap, and the overlap is on scope 3. And scope 3 is right now is the part that is most voluntary. So to the point about, this actually being a driver of systemic change, yes, there is going to be overlap, but that's not the point. The point is we need companies to take responsibility for their emissions, and together also for the corporate world to be driving innovation to solve this problem. So I think the double counting question is more a theoretical one, because we know what energy companies are saying. They're saying, as long as there's still demand, we will continue to produce. And if you don't basically fix the demand side of the problem, the supply side will always continue. It will just shift away to other types of companies that are producing fossil fuel energy. So setting science-based target is the corporate world's way of saying, we're going to attack the demand problem together, and reduce, basically reduce requirements for fossil fuels in the first place. But I agree, it does not rule out double counting entirely, although the GHG protocol is very clear, and it does its absolute best, but yes, there are blurred lines.
Thanks, Marina. So one last quick question before a closing one about tips and advice for the work you do. What size of companies does Qantas work with? Is it like the big ones, medium, small, or a range? What does it look like? We
work with I would say, medium to large size global multinational companies. We have definitely, specialist expertise in a few key sectors. I've definitely mentioned food and beverage companies, large global players, and it's because we're also experts in agricultural footprinting, which is, perhaps niche, but exceptionally important. And then we also support a number of organizations, large organizations in cosmetics, fashion goods, luxury products, and consumer sport.
Great. Okay, thanks. So the last piece then, just if in the last 2 minutes, wanted to get your thoughts, tips and advice for anyone who might feel like they want to do this kind of work, the work that you're doing, or related things. So in particular, a couple of folks were asking, as a strategist or a consultant role, is it well designed for people with a technical background, or actually do you need to come with the business knowledge, business experience as well, or instead? Someone else was asking, they're coming from a mid-career from business and sales roles. Do they need to go to grad school to be able to do this kind of work? So any kind of thoughts on how folks can get into supporting the work that you do or working on it?
I think there are kind of two parts to that question. I mean, the one is like on what types of skills are required, like technical versus strategic, and then the second is, sort of career transition. I mean, basically until 2.5 years ago, I was doing something completely different. I mean, I was working in marketing, running the readership business of The Economist, and effectively learned my sustainability journey on the way. So to that point, it is something that you can transition into. It is important to get education, and there are a number of courses available, like formal sustainability management courses or more technical ones, on GHG accounting, where right now there's such a requirement for people with more technical, capabilities to learn carbon accounting, to also then be able to translate that into software, to, build AI programs around these things so that we can make the whole processes more efficient. So I can only encourage anybody that is interested in, working in the corporate sustainability space. Right now, there's just a flood of job openings and a gap of skills. So train yourself up, pick an area. Think if you are more technical, and to those that want to get into, let's say, a role like mine was or is definitely related to, I have 2 decades of business experience, which helps to then be able to really, be on par and have conversations with, the C-suite on, how to engage in things like business model transformation and take the narrative a level above just a technical challenge.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Marina, for your time today, for all the insights, and for sharing your excellent knowledge and experiences as well. And thanks for continuing to be a valued member of our community. Thanks everyone for coming. Conscious of everyone's time, so I'll call it to a close now. But you are in our in our Slack community as well, right, Marina? So I don't know how often you get a chance to check it, but if folks want to connect with you, hopefully they'll feel welcome to do that. But yeah, thanks everybody. Take care and see you again soon.
All right. Thank you. Yes, I'll go into Slack. Thanks for the reminder. All right. See you all soon. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.